For our participants who've logged in on WebEx, we're just working on the audio here. We're going to just give it a couple seconds and see if we can get your audio up, and then we'll try to test it.
Could it just be the
Okay, for our members that have joined on WebEx, we're having difficulty in the council chamber with the WebEx audio. members that have joined on WebEx, can you hear us here in the chamber even if we can't hear your audio? Okay, Alder Ryan is nodding, that's good. Then all of these workshops don't require voting action at this point. This is just us developing the budget, so we won't need to roll call anything. Anyone who's joined on WebEx, if you need to speak right now, even unmuted, we can't hear you, so we'll need you to type your comments in the chat, and then we'll read them and get you the appropriate answers. So they're going to continue to work on that as we progress, but just so we can get underway and start on time, we'll start like this. We'll note that we've got a quorum present. I'll call the Finance Committee for Tuesday, October 20th, 2020 to order. The only item on these agendas is the 2021 budget deliberations. Right before the start of this meeting, you should have received an email from Mary Ann with the rankings that we all submitted for the supplemental spending requests. I guess, do you want to start off with that, Mary Ann, and we can go from there?
Sure. Thank you. No? Okay, there. So we put in the scores, and I provided a copy of the ranked scores, and I also submitted that to all of the department heads today. You can see we then sorted them. Those with the highest points, of course, were the ones that garnered the most support, and with the lowest points, the lowest support. A couple of them had a funding source already built in. The two motor pool, we would take from the motor pool fund. And then the parks, updating their recreation plan. One of the columns in the supplemental request is this an ongoing expense or a one-time expense? And I think we discussed that at a prior meeting that, you know, it's, I guess, I don't struggle with if we have a one-time expense and we want to use existing funds for that, like fund balance or savings from the 2020 budget year. When we have ongoing, that can be concerning because you fund it in the next year, and then the following year you have to fund that plus all of your other expenses. So you're basically just kicking the can down the street and dealing with the problem sometime in the future. So the one that garnered the fewest points was the parks updated recreation plan. That would be a one-time expense. They are required to have it every 5 years, but we wouldn't run into that expense for another 5 years. And it is somewhat important because the city doesn't qualify for some state aid programs for parks unless we have an updated plan. So when we don't have an updated plan, we don't qualify for example, stewardship funds, which the city has used on multiple occasions to help with riverfront development. So one option would be, and you know, particularly with parks, we know that they are going to experience some savings in their budget this year because of some of the lack of activities such as the opening of the swimming pools. So that would be one area because it's a one-time expense. But beyond those three, all of the rest of them would have a levy impact. And the top garner was the mental health evaluation, followed by the motor pool contracted services. Again, that would come from the motor pool fund. The special events staffing, then the physical therapist, the one FTE for the property appraiser, two-way radios that would have a funding mechanism, the social media videographer, the street maintainer, the recreation supervisor, and the preservation coordinator. I did attend, the league has been putting on periodic meetings for the finance directors across the state to talk about budget. We had one of those meetings today, and in talking to other finance directors, you know, communities are being very cautious about adding positions. Again, you know, that's a reoccurring cost that's going to take place annually, and with, you know, some of the uncertainty of what's going to happen with the state budget, you know, there weren't any communities on the call that were adding positions. Some of them were keeping positions open. I think Madison was actually furloughing staff. Everyone had to take a furlough as part of their budget. Other communities are in a little bit more difficult situation because particularly those that have built convention centers or performing arts facilities that are using room tax to retire debt. Those communities are in really difficult situations because they have debt payments that they need to make and they don't have a revenue source because room tax has fallen so greatly. The mayor shared with me today an article from the Post-Crescent, which was very interesting. They are one of those communities that is in difficult situation because they have, I think, 3 facilities that they're trying to fund with the debt retirement with room tax. Fortunately, they had some reserves that will get them through at least 2021. But the CVB director for the Fox Valley was saying that their tourism gurus are saying that it will be about 4 years of a recovery. And so, that might be something that you want to think about when you look at that special events staffing. What will special events actually look like next summer? And, how predictable is that? So those are just a couple of comments I have.
Okay, I guess I have a couple questions too. When I saw that special event staffing ranked high, I mean, obviously, having events that are safe and well-run are certainly, is certainly something that we want. Originally, when we considered the request last year, and then ended up not needing to hire the people, it was in inflation in the CSO group. Obviously, those are part-time employees, and then looking for someone else part-time that could mentor or train those individuals. And my question is, as events start to recover, assuming that, if events are allowed next year and those events then generate robust attendance, do we have to go basically from 0 to 100 in this program? Yes, we want to manage and staff events better, but is this something that, knowing it does generate an ongoing budget expense, is it something that we could phase in over a couple year span? Say that we would allocate half of this funding rather than ramping all the way up to 20, can we get to 14? And then maybe look at an increase the following year as events and event attendance start to recover. Could we gradually beef up this program? And then 2, we would know a little more about, what the impact of next year is going to be more. If we would reduce this number, from 135,000, to say half that and see where we would get on, 65,000. Could we get where we need to be? Could we get to a better place than where we're at, but maybe not all the way across the finish line? And we've got the police chief on with us. Do you have a thought on that at all, Chief?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I know that the budget's difficult, and I think this is a need for our community. I think this is something we've had a deficit in for some time. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a very important thing that that the council consider, and so I'll say that, and then if you're looking at potentially funding it at a level less than 100%, I think the way to do that likely would be to fund the CSOs and to fund the part-time police officers, and then we will do our best to manage that overtime budget. Because to your point, I mean, we don't know what that is going to look like next year. But I do think it's important. I mean, the CSOs give us the best bang for our buck, so to speak. I mean, they're the least expensive labor, and we can use them extensively. And so that was one of the reasons we wanted to increase the CSOs to a higher level, because they give us the best opportunity to provide the most resources at these events. And I think if we increase the CSOs, we need those part-time police officers, because they're going to be the ones that are working with the CSOs all of the time, and we need to have the ability to have people with with arrest powers and people that have the ability to mentor and lead these CSOs at these events. So I think those, if you're looking at funding it at less than 100%, that would be my ask and my recommendation. And, I'll do my best to manage that overtime budget so that we don't go over. And hopefully we can get there. But again, I think, we've been at a deficit at these events for a number of years now, and we've had concerns for a number of years about our ability to provide safety and security at these large events. They continue to grow, and our community has high expectations, I think, about the safety and security at those events.
Okay, and so of the split on the worksheet, 25,000 was indicated for the additional CSOs, 35,000 appropriated for the hiring of part-time officers. That would be the training component, and 75,000 for the overtime. So if we were to reduce the ask, were you asking us to take it out of the 75,000 for the overtime? And get you to the, if we take the 25 and the 35, we're at 60. If we were
Right.
going to try to fund under, were you looking for us to reduce the 75?
My ask would be to fund the 60, the CSOs and the part-time police officers,
Correct.
and then whatever remainder you think you can afford to fund the overtime for additional police staff at those events.
All right. What are your thoughts, committee? When we look at, when we look at this plan in its entirety, it represents almost 5 cents on the mill rate. And that's an ongoing expense. So each year that you add, your cost to continue starts out higher. So, we know that we have deficiencies in large-scale events. We were told a number of years ago that if we had to execute a mass evacuation of the municipal airport or of Marathon Park or, whatever in a large-scale event, that we are grotesquely understaffed to do that, even if a tornado comes through. It doesn't even have to be a mass violence type event. So we recognized in public health and safety over a year ago that we had to do something. And, we were kind of using a stopgap measure to fund it last year. We ended up not hiring the people, so we kind of lucked out. But, I think that Deputy Chief Barnes is right, that if events are allowed to go next year and the virus situation starts to rectify, people will have I think they'll have some reluctance to assemble in large spaces, but in events where they're outdoor in a large open space, I think they'll see robust attendance. I think that, even though we know that room tax and hotel stays may be a slow recovery, some of the events they're talking about are the local favorites, where tourism is less of a factor even. It's the locals that are there. So, what are your thoughts? Do you want to try to accommodate this ask, but maybe reduce it a bit? Because that is one of the larger requests that's in these supplements. If we took it to 65, they'd have the part-timers, they'd have the CSOs, and they'd have some overtime, but a minuscule amount. That's if we just cut it basically in half.
Lisa?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead, Dawn.
Are you still going to be using, Chief, are you still going to be using the emergency police to help?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, because those are volunteers.
Yep.
Without a doubt, we get a lot of bang for our buck there, let me tell you.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's free labor. I keep telling Larry that we're going to give him a 100% raise, because 100% of zero is still zero. Yeah, the emergency police have been fantastic. You know that as well as anybody.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll continue to use them, although we have seen the numbers in that unit decrease significantly. I think we used to be near 40, and we're about half of that right now.
Well, that's because I resigned.
I know, people love you, right?
Yeah, exactly, that's
I
what.
shouldn't use that in the past tense, people love you.
So that is something that we'll have to figure out as far as if we want to fund that, if at all, and at what level. That did score highly, so I think that's something that we have to grapple with.
I'd like to see it, to fund it at 60,000 and hope that somewhere along the line that we can give a little more.
Phase in.
Because I've been and worked at those events, especially the balloon rally, and it is insane. You need all hands on deck for that. You really, really
Right.
do.
Mayor?
Yeah, I just have a question. To what extent do we put some of the responsibility on the organizations that are putting these events on, does some of the permit costs cover some of this? Is there something we should consider there? Maybe right now isn't necessarily the time, but it's something that, I was reading about some campaigns, or some cities charging campaigns for the use of their police during these large assemblies and things like that, so just out of curiosity.
Over the years, and especially in the context of room tax, we've had some conversations with event organizers, and especially Wausau Events, because Wausau Events is, basically funded with our funds anyway. So then there was always the argument that if we instituted chargebacks to them, substantial chargebacks for services, that is like charging yourself because we're funding them in the first place. Second, there was always a fear that it would restrict their ability to conduct all of the events that people have come to appreciate that are well attended. And so, we always have backed off on charges for services, but, in the past, that has been even back to the former fire chief, was wanting to look into some substantial fees for, overtime and standby and call and things like that, were part of the expenses of conducting events. And so, we haven't to this point, but that discussion has happened in the past. I mean, I think that as tourism starts to recover, that's certainly something that we could revisit with the organizers. I mean, obviously, organizers and their boards change. The faces at the table change. And so their appetite to participate in some of that, control mechanism may be different than what it's been historically in the past. So I think, if we were to, as a committee, if we agree by consensus that we wanted to reduce the funding on that ask to $60,000, see where we can get for next year. Just there's so many, I guess, there's so much fluidity to whether or not events are even going to go, and if so, at what level and how many. This would really get them, at least 50% of the way to where they need to get, and then see if, like Dawn said, in future years, we could phase in a little more. What are your thoughts on?
Yeah. And I know, just to continue that thought, we did have this discussion last year when we were talking about the special events staffing and some way in which that the events, the organizers of the events can, if they don't, if we don't necessarily charge them, but they give them kind of a feeling of the amount of subsidy that the city provides for a lot of these events to happen. Because I know, sitting on the room tax committee, looking at some of these grant applications, the events are run on a shoestring, and they're not going to necessarily have the money that would be necessary to cover, the shortfall if we decide not to provide, the full amount of staffing for these events.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's, and I think that's a discussion that it would help for us to have with them in a small group setting before we get them in front of a committee, is to just really find out where they're at also in terms of funding and fundraising. And, obviously some events expend more resources than others.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think we should take that discussion a little further.
Yeah, I think the events need to be aware of, this is what it costs the city for you to put on your events. So that they're just a little more cognizant of the true costs. But yeah, finding a way to kind of scrape the dollars together. I mean, I'm okay with for now going, dropping this in half, and we cross our fingers that we can get that the if it's I'm guessing that the pandemic's going to linger on next year, and we might get lucky that the overtime's not going to be what we think it will be. So
Right. Well, and we would certainly be in a better spot in terms of manpower than we were last year when events were going, and we were really in a hole as far as what our response would look like if one needed to be. And like I said in our last meeting, so often it's easy for the organizer to write that their emergency plan is to call 911, but what that response looks like in terms of its effectiveness could be vastly different if you're trying to, get in and get a couple people out of a crowd of 12,000 with 2 entry points. So, okay, so are we kind of in agreement by consensus that for the purpose of our calculation, we want to reduce this one to 60 and then see where we end as we go through? Also scoring highly on that was the mental health evaluation and the motor pool contracted services. Motor pool would be funding that. I think from the scoring, it looks like you guys definitely want to include the mental health evaluations, fund it in full. Motor pool paying for their contracted services doesn't have an impact on the mill rate, so I would assume we'd want to include that. The physical therapy and athletic training, based on the scoring on that, are you in agreement that you also wanted to fund that in full? That looks like it's less than 1 cent on the mill rate as well. And that maybe has the potential to rein in some workers' comp costs as well.
If we could see a reduction in our workers' comp, I'd totally be for that.
Okay. 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 Deb is, let me just see what she's got on there. Special events needs more people, hire part-time bouncers, security from the area, county fairs, and others recruited from the city. So I think that what they were looking for was people that would have the ability to manage an emergency, that were trained in emergency management protocols, and that also had arrest power. Was that correct? You weren't looking for, because volunteers, you can get that from emergency police. Is that? Okay. Yeah.
So I think in terms of volunteers, Ms. Herbst's points in regards to emergency police is well stated. They're an organization that's been around with the Wausau Police Department for a long time. They're trained, they meet on a monthly basis, and they understand the protocols, they understand emergency management, they understand the expectations of managing the event, they have the communication tools to communicate with law enforcement and fire personnel. So I think from a volunteer standpoint, we're happy to recruit as best we can to get more people into the emergency police, but I think that's the avenue we need to take for volunteers. In terms of low-cost staff, I think, like I mentioned before, our community service officers are in that same boat as the emergency police, except for they're paid a wage to be there, but they're trained by the police department. They have the communication tools. They understand what the expectations are. And so we've seen, we've talked about it at Public Health and Safety over the years, some of the security firms that we've hired locally, or not we've hired, but that the fair's hired, and they've just been insufficient in regards to their ability to help provide security. So I think in that regard, I don't think that's a good avenue for the city to go down.
It's also hard to have, faith in that effort, just because the simple act and their purpose at the events that we've talked about in public health and safety is limited to making sure that people don't walk through a manned gate with an open intoxicant, and that often they can't even get that right. And that's even assuming the person's wearing a colored wristband. So, we've had, at least in events, of that scale, where that type of monitoring has been necessary, a lot of the failures have started with private security or with groups that refuse to hire private security and then have brought in their own volunteers,
Right.
and their volunteers either consciously look the other way or don't pay attention. And so we've had some big problems at the fair with beer gardens, trying to police them with volunteers. Dawn? Yeah.
On behalf of the police department, Chief Bliven, I'll tell you, the emergency police members are very well trained. And I will tell you, I was with that department for 20 years. And since I was there, the last couple of years regarding no drinking in the, help me out, where you
In the
have the
grandstand?
entertainment.
In the grandstand?
Grandstand.
In the grandstand, believe me, they were like eagle hawks there. There was no way that anybody got in. And if they did, the stuff was dumped out real fast, or they were ushered out very quickly. Our biggest problem that we had was, of course, with the VFW. The people that they had sitting there were not really watching people going in and out, and then they were coming up to go into the grandstand, but man, we got them at the East Gate. It was just so much fun, when you
was the
could
trouble
find
we had.
someone.
Yep.
And I'll tell you, years ago, you would be surprised how fast I could run up a hill to catch somebody. I was really fast, no doubt about it. But the police department has been great. I know that a lot of us have been trained in the past, too, regarding what to do in case of a tornado or anything, because Philip Renmeister has been a big help in training us on things like that. A big problem is we can't get anybody to volunteer anymore. That's the sad part. That's the part I feel bad about. If we could get more people, because it's a great organization. It truly, truly is a great organization and just trained very beautifully from the
Well,
PD.
that's just it. I think
You
the
know?
training component there is what sets them apart from normal volunteerism, is that they've actually got some skilled trainers behind them.
And the
So-
other thing, their biggest thing that they have at the end of the year, they have a banquet. That is their pay. Larry gets them $1 million candy bar. That's the pay.
That's the pay.
That's the pay.
That
And
is a
we're-
labor of
And
love.
we're happy as can be.
See?
Yeah, they're an outstanding group.
Okay.
They really are.
That's, okay, so we left off
Can I-
with.
Can I ask a
Go ahead,
question
sure, yeah.
about the mental health, or not mental health, the physical therapy? So it says there has been some cost savings for like time lost and workman's comp. Do you have like numbers? Is it a good ratio?
Yeah, so I don't have the full data. We just started this in May. So the fire department, I don't know if the deputy chief or the fire chief are in the meeting, but they probably could talk
Tracy
about
is.
that better because they've been doing this for at least a few years right now. So at the last meeting, last Thursday, the example I gave is an officer who had an off-duty injury, and he had torn his hamstring. And so the physical therapist said that's an 8-week injury, you're going to be off work for 8 weeks. And so the physical trainer that we have right now has a connection with a physician, so she can get our staff into that physician the next day, as opposed to if my wife tears her hamstring, she can't see a doctor probably for a week unless she goes to the walk-in or the ER. So that she's able to get the officer into a physician right away, get a treatment plan in place, and then is at the police department providing that service 3 times a week. And so they're getting the physical training that they need on site, and it's easy to schedule. And so that officer was able to, instead of having an 8-week injury, was back to work in 4 weeks. So we saved 4 weeks of backfill on overtime for a patrol shift for an entire month. So that, I estimate that to be about $8,000, and so, that's a quarter of what we're asking for just in that one case.
Yep. Okay, that's the thing, and I think to get people healthy and keep them, physically strong, I think then they're, like we had discussed when we did the pilot program, they're less prone to injury or less prone to serious injury if they're in, better physical shape to begin with. I think that's.
Yeah, absolutely. Another example is we have a lieutenant who has had a shoulder issue for a number of years, and he chalked it up to I'm 45, so I'm gonna have a shoulder injury the rest of my life, and and so officers and people who have those types of injuries in a physically demanding job are more likely to get injured, more often would call in sick if they're having issues with that injury, and so through working with the physical trainer, he was able to alleviate that pain, and he doesn't have that pain today as a result of working with her. So I mean, one, that's a quality of life issue that we can provide an employee, but less likely to be injured, less likely to be needing sick time because he's injured.
Sure. So we could have some internal savings out of that. Go ahead, Marion.
Oh, I was just going to remind the committee too, when we were concluding the meeting last time, we talked about the implementation of the pay plan. And if you recall, when we implemented it, because it was basically cost prohibitive to place everyone in the pay scale of where they would end up based on their current years of service, that everyone was placed at no more than midpoint. And that created some hard feelings on staff because they felt that they should be paid more. And so last year in the 2020 budget, so this year now, people that qualified, that actually belonged above midpoint, were given an extra step.
Right.
And then this year we had received some input from staff asking whether we would offer that program again. And of course, as time has marched on, we have had employees retire, and they are getting step increases. So, last year, since people got, those people that were deserved more got 2-step increases, some people then were no longer eligible for any more because they were where they belong. So the price of this additional step is going down each year.
Okay.
So we had told the committee it was about $22,000 to implement. Some of those employees are funded out of other revenue sources like the Community Development Authority. So I do have the breakdown now. So the general fund, or what the levy would have to pay, is about $13,000.
Okay.
The CDA would be responsible for $2,704. Metro Rides budget would be $1,664, and the utility, water and sewer would be about $4,243. So just to remind you
Now,
that
that gets one extra step, right? That's
Yes, that gives
We're
them
not
one
to the
extra-
end of the option 3 discussions at that point, 'cause
Correct.
I think we
correct.
figured that we'd be having that discussion for a number of years.
Yes, full implementation is still way over $100,000.
Right, and some were so far off that, you may do a bump or two every year, and you may not get that person to where they should be before they retire, based on their age, depending on where they're at in the spectrum. I think
Yeah.
so these prices did go down a lot, though. I mean,
Yes.
just to get that extra step then.
Yes.
In the discussion that we had with Public Works Director Lindman when he was here on Thursday, even when we were talking about the additional street maintainer, he said he even had some internal struggles as to whether or not you add another driver and another plow route and another truck, or you chip away a little more at taking care of the people you already have. And, they have had some recruitment and retention problems down there, that maybe some of this, bringing them a little closer to parity in terms of, fair treatment, that may do a lot for morale, rather than bring on, a brand-new FTE that presents a continual and ongoing cost for both their pay and benefits and the equipment they need to make that person function. And, I think that they were even wondering, just based on last year's complaint volume, is another plow route even necessary? Or is it a situational thing where the way a storm fell and the way people's hours on the road fell, that particular weather event generates a lot of complaints, but maybe subsequent weather events don't always. I think it just depends on where they were at with their, work week before it hit and how long it went on before they started their cleanup. And so, that's the same discussion we have to have about the property appraiser. And the question I have, and I think we have Rick on WebEx. Now, we can't hear him, so I'm going to ask him to type his answer in the chat if Rick can hear me. Are all of the allocated positions in assessment currently filled, or are there any openings? And is this one an additional based on, is this an added staff person and not filling a vacancy? Because I understood it to be an addition to the total staff. I mean, if it was a replacement, we wouldn't have it here, so. Yeah, I can't. We're not getting your audio, Rick. Or if he's in the building, maybe we could bring him to the chamber for the.
That's why I thought if we logged in on that computer, at least we could be able to hear people.
Okay, and so, well, and we're not getting Rick's audio, but, so that's the next thing we have to consider is, that scored relatively high, is that property appraiser position. And that, that adds almost 3 cents on the mill rate. Where do you guys, how do you guys feel about that position? I struggle with adding FTE also at this time, just not knowing where we're going to be at with next year. And, knowing that they've had, okay, so Rick did type in the chat, it's one extra position. So beyond the full-time staff they already have, assuming that they don't have any openings that they're trying to hire to fill, you'd be adding one more appraiser, more than they've had historically.
I guess I'm with you. I think adding positions right now might be a bad idea. I mean, holding off until we see sort of what's going to happen might be better. So, I mean, for any position, I think, for any FTE.
Yeah. That's a hard one. Just because the current staffing level may not be optimal, but they are functional, and they are getting the tax roll done on time. And they are, since Rick came on as assessor, he's been running a tight ship there, and they've been getting their stuff in on time, even though they might be a little burned out at the critical times of the year, because there are times that they're truly swamped. I don't know that this is the year to alleviate that pressure. Mayor?
Yeah, I'm wondering if this is one of those opportunities where we can work with the county on some of the things that we used to work together on. I think when it comes to property listings and things like that. It probably doesn't meet all of Rick's needs, but I think maybe this is one where we could kind of go in, because they have needs that they're not being able to meet. Since they changed the relationship with us a few years ago, I can't quite remember when, but it might be an opportunity there.
They do, or county does? County has needs that are unmet?
Yes, yeah, we used to help them out we put in property listings or some major, yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then Rick has indicated that this would take them back to full department. They report the new construction, and this position would help with that. So, if I remember right, did they have, eons ago, there was more employees in that department, and then through either attrition or downsizing, they did end up with a smaller staff, right? And now they're trying to work their way back up to where they had been, probably in the mid-2000s, I think is where, during the recession is when that happened, right?
Well, I think it was
Like-
later than that, 'cause,
Like 10, 11,
I mean,
12-ish, maybe?
I think there was a, discussion about privatizing
Okay.
and contracting out the service completely, and then at that time, there was some vacancies in the staff, and so council said, okay, we won't outsource, but we're reducing your FTE by one, because they had a vacancy
Okay.
to save money. I think this was when, Dave Overbeck was
I was
here.
going to say, it's
and-
maybe been 4 or 5 years-ish,
2014
maybe?
maybe, yeah.
I do recall that conversation, because we were trying to justify the savings that we would get by outsourcing versus the payroll and benefits, and then realizing that some of those contract services are perhaps better fit for smaller municipalities where they can take that cookie-cutter approach, and then realizing that their methods in our assessment department are way more in-depth, and they gather, store, and analyze way more data than what you would get from a contract assessor. So then we decided to stay the course, but then still to rein in the expense, we did not fill. And we've probably been, that position's probably been open for 5, 6 years.
And I think at one of Rick's comments, I'm not trying to put my words in his mouth, but, and I think other departments will, if not are, experiencing the same thing. When I first started working for the city, employees didn't leave. They left when they retired. They didn't, it wasn't a transient workforce.
Yep.
And so, people had a lot of training. They had garnered a lot of institutional knowledge. And so, over time, they were very efficient at their jobs. And now, as we are seeing our workforce become more transient, you spend more time training employees, and you have these vacancy periods. And so you almost need to have more staff because you have these vacancies on a reoccurring basis. And I think, that from talking to Rick during budget meetings, that's one of the things that they're experiencing, because they did just recently have somebody leave. And so, it does take a long time, and it is a big investment to get people trained to do a job, especially something like assessment, which, generally speaking, you don't get somebody off the street and they're like, oh yeah, I'm totally trained in the state of Wisconsin assessment laws.
Right.
So I think, that adds to the burden of his, staffing concerns. So.
Well, especially if you invest the time and effort into training somebody, and then they, leave and become someone else's fully trained employee, and then you're back to square one again with, not only the same learning curve, but then everyone else taking up the slack and the workload. So I can certainly understand the request. I think maybe that's something that we maybe should just put a pin in for now and see what else is on the list here. Two-way radios for DPW, looks like that could be funded by motor pool with no levy impact, based on its scoring and the reliability of the equipment that they're retiring, according to our conversation with Eric. It seems that, are we kind of in agreement that we wanted to fund that? Okay. And then we come down to the social media videographer, and this was an ask that, it started out in the police department as a promotional type capacity, but came to find that almost every department could use the services of a skilled videographer, and this was one that the mayor talked to us about. I had put a note on this one that this was one of the two items that I noted that in terms of how we communicate with the public seemed very important to her. We historically have tried to communicate better with our public, but, through a barrage of press releases and, a patchwork of social media posts, we aren't quite getting there. And I think in recent months, we have been able to, as a city, produce user-friendly, on-demand video content that people can view on the platforms that they are, where they're at. They don't need to read the newsletter to get information about what's happening in their city. Comb through our website to figure out, what's happening where. They can download a video on a Facebook page, and in 2 minutes, they know exactly what either happened or is happening. So I can also see the value in that, given the fact that it would have a citywide impact. And the fact that we have the videographer or a videographer already that we're already paying part-time. This would make that person full-time, so you'd certainly ramp up the cost of that person, but you might get more out of them. I guess that's something that we should talk ourselves through and see. That one, at that posted salary, is just over 2 cents on the mill rate.
So that would be, are you saying it would just be for the police department, or you're thinking it would be sort of a position all departments could use?
Police department, it sounded like from what Deputy Chief Barnes said, the police department would hire and supervise that person, but that person would be lent out to all other city functions that need video work done. Is that?
Yes, that's exactly right. Right now, they kind of have a good relationship managing the videographer, and all the equipment is there. But anytime I call up and I'm like, hey, I need another video, no problem.
Okay. So, what are your thoughts on that, committee?
I guess one of the questions I have is with the, I know the reason why the videographer was originally stationed in the police department, but why, when we look to expand the roles, haven't we looked at tapping Wausau Area Access Media and their resources for something like this? Other than they don't have the budget.
Well, there's that.
Yeah, so that's part of it, and I think when I imagine a world where we have a communications type department, it looks a little bit different, and it includes the public access folks probably. I don't know that, I think I technically manage the public access folks.
You do.
And I don't know if I'm able to devote the kind of time they need to cultivate a better, or a more robust presence. But I know that Captain Baton at the police department has been able to kind of get into that role. So I don't know, I think you do bring up a good point, though. I mean, we do have some resources that are kind of disparate. We could combine them all together where they could be kind of focusing their efforts. I haven't talked about that with the chief, though, so doing it in public is kind of fun.
That, and that's one thing that we have to, we have to look at what we have for, content, equipment, and skill set within our in-house staff that we already have, including the videographer. Go ahead, Chief.
Yeah, so, I mean, we did consider Wausau area, public access for our video purposes when we first started the program. I think there's a lot of demands that we have on that videographer, and it's, they have to be able to obviously use the equipment, of course, but they have to be able to interview. They have to be able to get the information out of the person that's communicating with them. It's a media type position that we're expecting from them. And we also have, there has to be my perspective is we expect a certain tone from that video. We have a certain message and a certain way we want to communicate that message. And those are the expectations. And I felt more confident in hiring somebody and managing them from within the department to be able to do that. That's my position on that. And I think we've got a great result from that, and that isn't to knock public access or anything like that. That's just how I feel we got the best results.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, and that is part of what we've talked about, citywide with, our usage of, or increased usage of social media. We look at the tools we have at our disposal to get the message out and, get our message out the way we need to tell it. And sometimes the message that we need to get out and the way we need to communicate that message is different than what you would get in a 5-second snippet on the, 6 o'clock news or in a print newspaper where there's only so much space to tell your story. And, I think that's where we were glad to see the videographer come on board in the first place, because you can take a more in-depth dive into a situation if you're producing your own content than you can if you, interview for 20 minutes with a reporter of some sort and they air 5 seconds of a soundbite, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way we used to communicate is we'd issue press releases. And press releases, we know, don't get read. I mean, people don't see the press release. They don't necessarily care about the information. They want to see the information in a video format. So that might sometimes be covered by, the news stations or the radio stations or the newspaper. But if we can produce that ourselves and present it in a way that is, to Lisa's point, much more in depth and not a 5-second or 10-second clip or a short article, and it gives 2 minutes of really good information. Our community understands government better. It builds trust in us as government officials, and that's how we should be communicating with our community if we want to. If we want to meet their expectations and we want them to understand what we're doing, we have to be engaged in things like videography and social media and doing those types of things.
Well, and I think whether that person works at the PD or whether they are, working in a communications department at some point, we don't have one now, but if we had a, public relations and communications arm, which I think that's a separate discussion for us to have, but certainly a valid one because it's something that we've sorely needed. And, we've been wanting to add way back to, the administration that was here in '08 and '09, and we just have never gotten across the finish line with that. So, but I think that, that position, that really is kind of a new frontier for us. That's, that isn't really even adding FTE to serve an existing function. That's an area that we need to go down in terms of communication with the public that, I think we need to do a better job or continue to do the job that we've been doing in a better way and do more of it because it's been a positive. I mean, even things as simple as putting up a Facebook video about drive-through voting. That's had a ton of views, and it's only been up for a week. And it instructs people for how to do it, so maybe fewer people will show up unregistered without the proper documentation. I mean, I think everyone's life is easier if people understand, just this week we've had a flap in some neighborhoods about leaf pickup. Well, if we would put out a video message about what's wrong with leaf pickup today and why they may not have gotten to people, and what happens after it snows, because I've fielded 14 calls about this since Thursday, I think that helps. The other thing it does is quell frustration. So people's first reaction when something doesn't happen on the expected date is to be frustrated, then mad, then call their council person, and then just continue down the mad until we get that fire put out. If we were good communicators using those platforms and we were able to do more of it, I think we'd come out the other side in a better spot.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I'm sorry.
go ahead, Mary Ann.
Oh, I was just going to say, listening, I know the mayor wants to do a strategic plan, and we're going to be, bringing a budget modification in the 2020 budget to accomplish that. And, the comments that you made that we've been trying to have someone in communications since 2009 or something like that.
9 or 10, it's been a while.
And, really, that's what a budget is about, is, matching your priorities to your spending. And so it seems to me like maybe we have not done a good job of that since we've been trying to accomplish that since '09. And, we see departments do workarounds that when we fail at prioritizing because they come up with other solutions, which is really what is going on here in my mind. So perhaps you would want to do something like establish, rather than funding this position, sorry, Ben, but putting money in contingency and really taking your strategic plan and saying, we are going to look at what a communication force would look like for the city, where would it rest, all of those things, so that you have a well-thought-out plan, and then the funding is there. Because you have a videographer right now. He's not working enough hours in your mind, but you have one.
Right, and their
So-
current budget would still fund that person to
Right.
continue, right? So,
Maybe that would be a solution. You're not authorizing a position. My understanding is this hasn't actually gone to HR to
Correct.
create the position yet. So, maybe something like that where you have $40,000 or something that you put into a contingency fund to deal with communications once you've completed your strategic plan. That would be one way. And the other point I was going to make, so was the full-time going to be in addition to this part-time videographer that you have right now? So I don't believe that we then deducted what you're currently budgeting. So, the
Okay.
financial impact probably isn't the 70,000, it's probably less than that.
It's probably like 55. I think we budget
Okay.
15 right now for
Okay.
it. And, so I think, you always talk strategy, and I really appreciate that. I think you're right about that, looking at it in terms of a strategic plan. I said, what I would counter with that is that there's no doubt that we need this position for citywide.
Right.
We can go through the strategic planning process and have money in contingency for it, but there's no doubt that the result will be that we need this position. And so if that's the case, we should just fund it.
right.
That's
Well,
my
and
position.
whether the hire, if we know we need it, and we're going to go through the plan process to find out we need it, then the question becomes, do we fund it now and use the results of the strategic planning effort to validate that process? Or do we continue with the videographer that we already have in the budget, even though that's short hours? And, then with that strategic plan should come a series of implementation steps. And, then by the time you get through a strategic planning process, you're probably looking at a physical hire in '22, not in '21, because you'll use half of 2021 for your strategic planning process. There's meetings and there's stakeholders and there's, ranking and there's, it's a lot. And so, by the time we'd get through that, you probably wouldn't bring that person on in the '21 budget. You'd plan for them the following year, wouldn't you?
Well, I think that's why we were going to bring the budget mod to the October 27th meeting, so that the retaining of the consultant could take place fourth quarter of 2020, so that, the strategic plan would be first quarter of 2021, and then, you would be set, because we don't want to be in a situation where the strategic plan comes and we are already in budget and we're not able to then prioritize spending for 2021 as well. So I think that's why we were planning on bringing it to the next finance meeting, this budget mod. So, most likely you would be able to, by mid-2021, start,
Well, and then
initiating some of the,
Assuming a mid-year hire, then you'd also be looking at saving 50% of the salary, because you probably wouldn't employ that person till July. So instead of 55 or 69,000, you'd probably be somewhere more like 40.
Is it possible to get like a revamped tax rate impact, since it's not going to be the whole
Yep.
69?
Yes. And let's assume, if we note then too, as a result of the strategic planning, we can choose when to fund that position. So if you chose in your budget to fund it not to be hired prior to July 1st, you would budget half the salary and you'd hire that person knowing that the following year you're going to have 12 months of that person's pay, but you have some time to plan for it. So, if it looks like 55,000 above what we have, and we're going to maybe need half of that on a mid-year hire, we'd have some savings.
so if we're just taking the 15,000 out that was already budgeted, we'd be at about 1.9 cents,
109 or 190?
0.019,
Okay. 0.019, so just under 2 cents.
yes.
Okay,
And that would be funding it for
The whole
the
year,
whole year?
yes.
okay. Okay, so then half the year, you're probably at about 10 cents. well, or a point,
or a penny.
yeah.
Point
That's
zero,
not-
point
010.
019.
Yeah.
Is it point 019 or 1010?
0.019.
Okay, so it'd be 2 cents.
2
Yeah,
cents.
just,
So we'd be,
just a little, yeah,
Yeah.
just under 2 cents. Isn't that
right.
what you said before?
Yes, so we'd
Yeah.
be at 1, 010 if we did a mid-year hire.
Yes.
So for a penny on the mill rate, you could get that person for at least half the year and start to implement your goals. You know, what, does that seem like that's amenable to us, at least for the purpose of budgeting? Because then, once we figure out what of these supplements we want, then Mary Ann will work those into the calculations and figure out where we'd be at with our true mill rate after the impact. And then we, you know, then have to dive into some other facets of that for tomorrow and Thursday. Are you guys interested in doing something like that, mid-year hire?
I think so, yeah, to Mary Ann's point, I think that's a more, rational or forward-looking solution, because I think, if we're looking at strategic planning, and communications is an important part of the strategic plan, we really need to look at, and sort of that, an all-encompassing type of communications, and not, with the fragmentation we've got now. And that's kind of the thing that I fear, that if we fully fund this position, we're going to be more fragmented, because we've got, what's happening over here in police, we've got these other communications outlets, we've got the capabilities that Wausau Area Access Media can do, and I'd like to see something maybe a little more thought out if we're going to be tapping this videographer citywide, in how it can be used in a more logical citywide function as maybe a true public information officer for the city.
That's the one thing that we had talked about, and when we were, I don't know, maybe it's a sign that I've been at this too many times, but the first time I was the council president in 2010, I sat down every month with the mayor, and we would try to figure out really what our goals were, what our shared goals were between him and the council, and figure out where we had to bridge those gaps to get from point A to point B. And one of the things that he was very seriously considering, or believed we needed even back then, and that was in 2010, 2011, that was the Tipple administration, he wanted a communications director, period. And that, whether that was encompassed video, social media, public information, all of those things rolled into one. He felt back then already it needed to be somebody's job to manage the messaging of the city and get it in people's hands in an effective and timely manner, and not wait for the next big scoop on the news. And so then when we fast forward a few years, Milky was trying to do the same thing, and we could never get the budget for it. But, it wasn't video only, but it was all things communications. And, he too found that he was issuing an awful lot of press releases and, sporadic Facebook posts, but not one concerted forward-pushing effort to get messaging out to residents. And, that's something like what we could, as a result of our strategic plan, really go forward on. So, okay, so if we wanted, do we want to include that at 1 cent for the mid-year? Was that where we left off?
Yeah.
I
Okay,
think so, yeah.
okay. Then that leaves us, the things that ranked pretty low. The street maintainer, that's an extra plow driver and plow route, which then probably would result in some equipment needs, either in the motor pool or in CIP. What do you guys feel about that? Do you want to hold on that for a while? I mean, we don't even know what kind of winter we're going to have yet, although it seems to have started early.
I mean, I can see the rationale for like the complaints and, winter maintenance, but, I mean, if it's going to cause a sort of snowball, yeah, if it's going to
Snowball?
cause, yeah.
Pun
snowball
intended.
kind of effect, yeah.
Yes.
With more equipment required and all that stuff, maybe holding off just for this season at least.
Yeah, and just see where we come out next year as far as the true impact of the pandemic, which we don't know yet. Okay, so we
Yeah, and I-
hold off on that.
Yeah, I guess we didn't even ask Eric last week if DPW has the equipment, for a maintainer, another truck to drive.
He
or
talked
whatnot.
about needing another truck if we hired this person.
Okay, so there would be an extra,
Yeah,
more cost over and above
Yeah.
that, so.
so, yep, so that would be the gift that keeps on giving,
Yeah.
sort of. Recreation supervisor, you had some material on that, and that's an additional position following the retirement of the head of the recreation. I think Jamie talked about that in our last meeting. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, that's co-funded, 60/40 city-county. I don't believe they've completed their process yet to know if they would even fund their share yet or
Yeah,
have
it's
that.
not in their budget.
It is not in their budget. So, at this point, then, rather than look to hire someone part-time, we'd be best to hold as well until they're interested in doing their part. Preservation coordinator, this is the one that essentially plans to save street trees and tree canopy. This program, like Eric told us, is kind of modeled, it's a part-time position, but it's modeled after a program that we had learned about where they're trying to minimize the impact of street trees from street and sidewalk projects. There are always, with new construction projects, at least from my experience in SISM, there's always complaints when you take down, fully grown trees and you put in a road and then you replace them with new little trees. But the one thing that we've talked about in that committee a little bit more so than Parks views it through a different lens. And so taking out a mature tree and having to regrow tree canopy is super concerning to the Park and Rec Committee. But on the SISM committee, trees are a renewable resource. So even if you need to remove a tree to do a project, as long as you replace it with a tree that will grow to be a thriving tree, it takes some time, but, that impact is temporarily lost. And so it's hard for me, I struggle with funding even a half-time position when we have a city forester. And even though that person doesn't have a ton of time to develop towards street trees, I would certainly think that, as needed on a consultant-type basis, if there's a project and there's a question as to whether or not certain trees can or should be saved, we've been tapping those resources all along without hiring. So it seems to me that it's definitely a want, but I don't see it as a critical need. I guess I struggle with the critical need part on something like that. What do you guys think?
I was kind of surprised this one scored as low as it did because of all of the outcry I get, it's the taking of trees during a construction project.
Yes.
It's the one that always gets to me. And then the replanting of the trees too. There's always concern that the trees that are replanted may not be the right type of tree.
Sure.
For the long-term viability of that streetscape. But yeah, when it comes to the money, it's tough because we're looking at other types of funding other things here that are just as important or maybe more so. So it's I don't know. I wish I'd seen it score higher so there would be more. I'd feel a stronger need in order
Right.
to try to save it.
This particular request, at least for me, is one that I would love to see in a non-pandemic environment. Because I think when we had some more certainty with where we're going to be at in terms of, state aids and things for next year, I'd have a hard time building this into our cost to continue right now, not knowing what's coming. And so if we would fast forward a year or so where we've kind of leveled off from some of those impacts, this would be a lot easier to think about in the future, I feel like.
What do we have for street projects in 2021? We don't have any large projects.
There's a few, there's 3rd Avenue from Randolph Street to Boss Creek Drive. That's got some mature boulevard trees,
Okay.
a couple of which need to go because they've been damaged. That same neighborhood, though, I will tell you from experience, will likely not complain as long as there's some new trees put in that will eventually grow up. That's just they're more concerned about the assessment than the tree loss. So, we've got a few other residential streets, but, not a major main thoroughfare,
Like First Ave,
yes,
Town
no,
Line,
nothing to that extent, or like
Yeah.
Kent Street when they took down
10.
tens of
Yep.
mature trees.
I got residents that still complain about that.
Yes, that, and, that same thing happened on Spring Street out in Riverview. That was a real sore spot. Even though they tried to reduce the tree loss, they couldn't reduce it completely. So, we don't have anything that big.
So if we
For next year?
can punt for a year, this would be the year to do it.
It feels like it. What do you guys think? Punt, and then maybe communicate with Eric that we'd like to see this ask in the future, but once we know more about where we're going to be down the line. Because they may find, even as a department, that they have completely different needs next year, and they may wish they hadn't asked for this next year if the reductions in aid or something are worse in areas that they desperately need. That's what I wish we had a crystal ball, but we just don't. Okay, and then we talked about update recreation plan. If we earmark some savings at the end of the year, we could certainly go back to the list and we could commit to funding that out of surplus if there is one. You know, that way there wouldn't be any uncertainty for the park department. They could start their process and get things moving, knowing that they would be funded from savings in other areas. Okay, so then that recap would give us we'd be funding the mental health evaluation, the motor pool contracted services, the special events at $60,000, the physical therapy, athletic training in full. We would not be funding the property appraiser. We would be funding the two-way radios for DPW. We would be hiring the videographer mid-year to reduce the cost by half. We would not be hiring the street maintainer, the recreation supervisor, or the preservation coordinator, and we would commit to using savings to fund the recreation plan. Are we kind of in agreement by consensus on those items?
Did you want to include that step increase?
That is something we should talk through also. We made, prior council and prior HR committees, and this committee also, made a commitment to the team, to the employees and workforce, that we would try to, in incremental bites, try to implement what became known as option 3 from the wage study. And so, you know, we certainly could never get there all in one jump, but if we could take the step here where, you know, we'd be looking at a general fund expense of $13,000, that really, I think, would do a lot in terms of workforce morale, to get people a little closer to where they probably should have been 2 years ago, because that wage study is already 2 and maybe almost 3 years old, and people are not at parity, but they know that we can't afford to get them to full parity all at once. But I think if we take years off and opt to do nothing along the way, that really doesn't bode well. What are your guys' thoughts on that? Take that step up, have Mary Ann include that for our next calculation?
Yeah, if we're not putting on new staff, I think we need to support the staff that we already have.
Correct. Okay. All right, so then she can factor those figures into the budget for the city share, knowing that we've got some alternative fund sources from CDA, Metro Ride, and from the utility.
Yep.
To get those steps. Any other decision that you need us to make tonight on any other facets of the budget, or?
So, sure. I guess a couple of steps that we need to talk about. One is, you know, if you want to delve deeper into the budget, you know, in future meetings, do you want to have presentations by the departments on their individual budgets? We could set those up for tomorrow and Thursday if you wanted to. I don't know, you know, if you had specific questions maybe about an individual department or a couple of departments that you wanted to have come in, we could do that too. I guess, next step from a statutory basis is to conduct the public hearing. And the public hearing takes place on November 10th, which is our first meeting. Historically,
Yep.
is taken place at the council meeting at the first meeting in November, which is the November 10th meeting. The state statutes indicate that we have to publish our budget and, or a summary of our budget and a notice in the newspaper at least 15 days before that. So when I count back, you know, we have to have that published by around no later than October 26th. And then because our publication is so large, we have to give the newspaper some time to actually get it in the paper. So we're, you know, approaching that time. So I can add these items because you're, you know, contemplating putting them in the budget. The other thing that's kind of on the agenda of budget contemplation is that development for WAS, right?
TID 7 in the mall, yep.
So, I know at the first meeting, when it was introduced, there was the question, should it be a placeholder in the budget? So I guess I'm just asking for clarification, if you want it in the budget publication, or if you don't want it in the budget publication. There's no law that says you can't add things after the budget publication. So we often make changes to the budget,
I feel
council
like,
does.
though, here's how I feel, and this is when I was talking about benchmarks to start with, or placeholders to start with, is if we want to ask the public in a public hearing format to react to our budget, they need to be able to see and react to our total budget, including our contemplated spending. So let's assume that even half the council is interested in participating in that project with WAS and modifying TID 7 to minimize the taxpayer risk. To not disclose that to the taxpayers on the front end for that budget hearing, to me, feels disingenuous. If we believe that at some point next year, we may be interested in participating in that project, we should disclose it right now and let people come in and react to the numbers that are associated with that and the impact on that particular tax increment district. Because if you go through your entire budget process and we go through all this exhaustive deliberation and we release the budget and the public reacts to it, and then we go back later and go, oh, wait, we want to add $3.5 million, and oh, by the way, we're going to amend a TID to do it, to me, that feels like you are trying to pull something over on your taxpayers. So, if you include it in the publication and you put it out there for people to react to, that is certainly not a final vote to approve the project. It's not the approval of any development agreement. It's not a vote for any forward motion. But it is disclosing to the public that this spending may happen or may not happen. But I think you have to at least tell people.
Because then if it's in that, I mean, we'd be able to see like how much it would cost, how much it would change things.
Yes,
So I
right.
mean, this
Yes.
is a hypothetical, it's a conversation piece in
Yes.
essence, right? So I would like to see it in there. I'd want to see what the implications are going to be.
Right. So, the only other option, so the state has prescribed in the statutes that tells you exactly what you have to say in your budget publication. It does say that you can publish other information as well, but it can't be part of that publication. It has to be an additional publication. So, that would be the only other option that I could see if you really wanted to make this transparent as far as the budget process is concerned, would be a separate publication where you would include that one more time, that you were contemplating adding that to the budget, but it had not been added at this point or
Well,
something.
and there's so many additional steps. So assuming that we even factor it into the budget, we factor it into the public hearing process, even assuming that we would then approve that budget, then that there also is a series of meetings in finance and economic development jointly where we have to approve a term sheet, we have to approve a final development agreement. We've decided as a council, as this council, that we want to see development agreements before they go out the door. We don't want to just approve the term sheet and then let them go willy-nilly. So we'd have at least 2 votes to approve the terms of those deals before $1 gets put into anything anywhere. And so I just feel like we're being proactive on the front end to let people know what the money part of this all looks like. And then we can decide, based on the feedback that we took, we've got the public hearing comments. We'll certainly have, we held a separate public hearing on the mall. We've had 3 public feedback opportunities for that. We'll have data from that to help us in our future decisions. But including that in your publication and even approving your budget is not the approval of the project itself. And I think that's where, we want to be upfront about the potential for the expense, but then we want to be deliberative later in how we actually approve the expense. I guess that's where I'm going. So if you guys are in agreement with including it, then Mary Ann would include it in the publication. And, then those separate steps would certainly have to fall in line, subsequently. Is that kind of where we're heading? Everybody's nodding.
Okay,
I'd like
so
to
I'm
see
going to
it.
include these items that you've recognized today,
Yep.
as well as the mall deal
Yes.
in the
Yep,
budget
and the TID
publication.
7 modification as
Yep,
well for
yep.
the joint review board and whatnot. Okay? All right, and then, and so we've got a comment on chat from Deb. So when you asked about presentations by the
Yes.
department, Deb said, yes, definitely, some weigh-in from the departments. She would also like to know about savings by department due to COVID and special events being canceled, and just to have a synopsis of what their unspent budgets for 2020 might look like.
Okay.
So that way, if we are going to have some surplus or some carryover, we kind of get a heads up on what that picture
Okay.
looks like.
I'll get those
I mean,
set
there's
up
always
then.
some carryover for unfinished work, but if there's carryover work and money, it's good to know about that, so.
Okay.
And, okay. Anything else that, so if we have those, we should by Thursday night, I think, once we have our numbers, and will you have your manufacturing numbers from the state by then, do you think?
I don't know.
By
I can
Thursday?
go and check on those. Otherwise, we can, as soon as we find them, I can put together another meeting to go over it one last time as
Right,
well.
or we can go with, or we can move forward. If we need to have, at least this week, say we get to our last workshop on Thursday, we should be close to a finished product.
Yep.
And then we have a finance meeting the 27th, which is Tuesday. So if those numbers come in after your publication, we can always true that up
Yep.
based on the actual, but at least then get our part of it done so that we're ready for the publication.
Okay.
And, then certainly when we have our public hearing November 10th, and then the budget we ratify would include the actual state numbers.
Okay.
So we had firm numbers on health insurance and all those
We
benefits
do,
already.
yes.
That's easier.
Really, the only thing that we're waiting for is that one manufacturing number from the state.
Okay, so everything else was contained in this book the way it was
Yes.
presented.
Yes.
All right. Anything else, committee, that you want to delve into for tomorrow night? Because Mary Ann will have this refigured tomorrow, I'm
Yep.
pretty sure. She's
Yep.
fast on that. Okay, and then we'll decide if after tomorrow's, and the other thing, with presentations by the departments, we'll see if we can get as many of them done tomorrow as we possibly can, and then save our Thursday session to hammer through any final details before that publication. So if anybody's not available and we need to carry their presentation through to Thursday, that's fine, but if we could get most of them tomorrow, that would be ideal.
Okay. We'll get working on that.
Okay, anything else, committee? If not, I'll take a motion to adjourn, and we'll see everyone tomorrow. Motion by Herbst, is there a second? Second by Watson. Members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. We'll stand adjourned, and then we will reconvene tomorrow night at 5:15.